Welcome to episode 217 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, once again, we get to speak to retired agent Kevin Rust, who served 29 years with the FBI. Kevin spent most of his career in Mississippi and resident agencies out of the Jackson Division, including 13 years in a one-person office. In this episode, Kevin reviews his initial investigation of WorldCom, at the time the country's second largest long-distance telephone provider. The corporation's senior executives orchestrated a scheme to inflate earnings in order to maintain WorldCom's stock price. It was a major accounting scandal in the early 2000s. During his bureau career, Kevin also had assignments in Chicago, Budapest, FBI headquarters, and the FBI Academy in Quantico. He was a crisis negotiator who responded to many incidents, both domestically and internationally, and taught negotiation concepts to hundreds of state, local, and international officers. Kevin Rust, who prior to entering the FBI was a CPA with Price Waterhouse, currently works as a contractor for the FBI's International Corruption Unit, tracing money flows and identifying for seizure assets that were purchased with money stolen by foreign kleptocrats. Kevin was previously interviewed in episode 91 and episode 117 regarding civil rights matters. He dedicates this episode to the memory of his friend and colleague, retired agent Jim Davis. If you're listening to this episode on or about the day it's posted, I want to wish those in the U.S. happy Thanksgiving. I hope you're able to spend the day with loved ones and stay safe. Now, I don't have any Black Friday specials, but I do want to remind you that my books would make wonderful Christmas and holiday gifts. There's a link to where you can pick up copies in your podcast app's description of this episode. I also want to welcome new listeners, especially those of you I met online at Podcast Row during CrimeCon House Arrest. Boy, that was fun, but exhausting. I'll tell everyone more about CrimeCon in my December Reader Team email, where I'll also explain when and how the FBI gets involved in a murder investigation. That was the number one question asked by those who visited my virtual booth. This podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my monthly email, I keep you up to date on the FBI in books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, which is a colorful list of more than 50 books about the FBI written by the FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoir. You can join my reader team on my website or use the link in your podcast app's description of this episode. I want to thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest back again, Kevin Rust. Hi, Kevin.
Hi, Jerry.
You have been on the show twice before, so this is your third time, so congratulations. I don't know if you win a prize for that or what, but your prior appearances, you have been my go-to guy for civil rights investigations. In episode 91, we talked about a reopened Klan murder case involving the murder of Mr. Ben Chester White. And then in episode 117, you did a case review of a police excessive force under color of law investigation that, you conducted. But this time, we're doing something totally different. We're going to be talking about one of the biggest corporate fraud cases in the history of the FBI. WorldCom. I'm surprised, when I learned that you were the original case agent. Where do you want to start?
Well, yeah, it's especially since at the time I was in a one-person RA in southern Mississippi. So that's even a little more surprising. But it kind of goes back to my background, which I was a CPA before I came in the FBI. I had worked at Price Waterhouse for 2.5 years, and then I got into the Bureau and got assigned to Mississippi, which the regular listeners have heard before. You've had Mike Anderson on to talk about the Enron scandal. In 2001, I believe it was, the Enron scandal broke. And I was sitting there in that one-person RA, and I got a call from headquarters asking me if I would like an all-expense-paid transfer to Houston, Texas to work Enron, because I had those magic letters behind my name, the SAA, Special Agent Accountant. You know what that means, Jerry, right? So I told them, no, thank you, because one, I was pretty happy where I was in the RA. And two, it just sounded like it was, I knew that they were bringing in lots of accountants from around the Bureau, and it sounded like it was just going to be a massive years-long investigation, which is what it turned into. At that time, I wasn't really interested in doing that. So I said, no, thank you. And then I heard that there was going to be a draft of accountants because they didn't get enough volunteers when they were calling around. And that did end up happening. I think they transferred about 10 accountants to Houston. Mike would have the exact numbers. 5 of them were voluntold, were told that they were going to, go to Houston and work Enron. And I was quite happy to not be one of those. And so I thought, well, I dodged that bullet. But during the next spring and summer, WorldCom was starting. Rumors were going around, and I'll tell you why, in Mississippi, that WorldCom was in trouble also. The stock price was dropping like a rock. And what I wanted to do now is give you a little background on what WorldCom was and how it got started. This was a Fortune 500 company, the only one headquartered in Mississippi. And there's a reason for that WorldCom started out, a guy named Bernie Ebbers was the CEO of WorldCom. And he just died this year. We'll hear more, but he was in prison. He was released on a compassionate leave because he was doing poorly health-wise last December, and he died in February. Bernie Ebbers was a Canadian that played basketball, and he got a scholarship to a small Mississippi college to play basketball. And he liked it down south, a little warmer, I guess, than Canada. He liked it. He stayed. And he ended up buying a couple motels in a small town called Brookhaven, Mississippi, just north of Macomb, Mississippi, where I was assigned at the time. And after he did okay with those motels, some friends of his got him involved in a company called LDDS, which was Long Distance Discount Service. And this is going to go back to the horse and buggy days for your younger listeners for a little bit here. But the reason LDDS was around is because, if you remember, Jerry, back in the days when we were young, long distance, you could only get it through AT&T. It was a monopoly, and they charged you a fortune for long distance. You didn't talk very long to your family. Do you remember those days, Jerry?
Yes, I do. Wow, I had forgotten about that.
Yeah, you didn't talk very long because it cost, like 10, 15 cents a minute, more than that, even sometimes, to call long distance. And you only had your landline phone, of course. But what happened, there was the Supreme Court case where they broke up AT&T as a monopoly. And what they decided was they created these regional baby bells that if you have a landline, you still get your phone. Well, not anymore, because now you get it through your ISP for the most part. But they created these baby bells that for a long time provided local service. They also provide long distance, but they allowed competition with the long distance. So all these discount companies were created to try and offer cheaper long distance. So LDDS was one of these in Mississippi. And what they did was they'd give you a card. You probably remember this too. They gave you a card where you called an 800 number, and then you'd put in a code, and then you dial your number, and you would get charged, and you would put minutes on that card and stuff. It sounds so old-fashioned.
It certainly does.
But I remember those days. As a matter of fact, I was an LDDS customer when I started out in Tupelo, Mississippi, so I could call home to my parents and friends and back in D.C., Maryland area. Bernie Ebbers was a good businessman. He was, he's in the right place at the right time, but he also grew LDDS by buying a bunch of corporations. And what he did was just keep buying and buying and buying and consolidating. He started in the South and then he spread nationwide until he was buying huge companies. He bought MCI, was a really big long distance provider in this thing. And the last major purchase that WorldCom made before the scandal was taking over MCI. So he grew from this basket, and he actually coached basketball when he was running the motels too. So he goes from this basketball coach, most small motel owner, to one of the most important CEOs in the country. But he kept it in Mississippi. He kept the corporate headquarters in Mississippi. They had offices all over the country. By this time, they were a massive company. But they built a campus, a small campus outside of Jackson, Mississippi, a little town called Clinton, where they had about 3 buildings where the corporate headquarters were.
And where exactly was your resident agency, your one-man resident agency located?
So I was an hour and 20 minutes south of Jackson. So the Clinton was kind of another 20 minutes in the other direction, west of Jackson. So I was about an hour and 20 minutes away. But Mississippi was extremely proud of WorldCom, of what it had become, because this was our, corporate, and tons of Mississippians bought stock, and tons of Mississippians made a lot of money because they bought the stock early on. And they made a lot of money, but it was our, one shining thing was the WorldCom in Mississippi. It was our big entree into the Fortune 500, the business world. Great story from here. This company started in the early 80s, and this was now 2001, 2002. But like I said, in 2002, the stock is dropping like a stone. There's a lot more competition. There's been kind of a bust in the telecom world. And there's rumors, and I don't know where these rumors, but I even heard them down in my one-person RA, that there might be something wrong at WorldCom, kind of an Enron type of situation. And I just heard this, but nothing specific. So that was where it stood in June of 2002. And how did I become the case agent? As you know, Jerry, this is another thing we all know, that almost every FBI agent at one time sits on a wiretap. I think some of your other guests have talked about that we monitor wiretaps.
Especially if you're a new agent, because at that point, they just want bodies.
Exactly. That kind of plays into this story here. So there was a drug wiretap being run in Jackson by one of the squads in Jackson. And I happened to be administratively assigned to that squad, even though I was a one-person RA. My supervisor was a squad supervisor, and I had been in the bureau now 15 years. And he told me that I was going to participate in the monitoring of the wire, which I was not extremely happy about, because I was having to drive an hour and a half, sit on a wire for 8 hours, drive an hour and a half home, to do it the next day for a couple of days, and then I'd do it, get a week or a week and a half off while other members of it did it again. I was not happy. I didn't really say anything, but I'm thinking, I've been in 15 years. I shouldn't have to do this. But it also took me away from my other cases too. But, I was a good team player, so I was doing it. So one Friday afternoon, I'm sitting up in Jackson. I'm dressed in jeans and a polo shirt, sitting in the wire room, just monitoring this wiretap. And the white collar crime supervisor and another new agent that I didn't know walk in. His name was Perry Turner. He's currently the SAC in Houston. He's a great guy, Perry. So Perry said to me, he said, "Kevin, the SAC wants to see you." And it's never good words to hear as a street agent, because my mind immediately goes to, okay, what have I screwed up lately? Because SACs usually didn't want to see you to give you good news or
No.
So I thought, I immediately start thinking, what have I done lately that could get me in any trouble? And there's always, if you're a good agent, there's often things that could get you in a little bit of trouble. But I was thinking, what could it be? And so I told Perry, I said, well, I'm on the wire. And he said, well, that's why this first office agent is here, to sit on the wire. I said, oh, this isn't good. That means I'm not coming back to the wire room after I meet the SAC. So I thought, that doesn't sound good. But we start walking down the hall, and I start thinking, and I thought, I'll bet this is WorldCom, because I am SAA, a CPA, 15 years in the Bureau. I thought, I bet this is WorldCom. And I said to Perry, I said, is it WorldCom? And he nodded.
So, so
Okay.
what did you know at that point? You had heard something in the
There were just,
newspaper? Or?
no, not, I don't know if it was newspaper or it must have been, I don't know where I would have heard it otherwise back then. Well, it probably wasn't the internet in 2000. Well, it might have been in 2000, but just that there were rumors. Everyone knew WorldCom stock price had just cratered. And there were rumors that there was some kind of problems at the company. And since Enron had just happened, everyone was thinking some kind of scandal. And Tyco was another company. There were a lot of corporate scandals right around that time. So that's what I thought. So I thought, and so we're walking up to the SAC's office. So I was relieved that I wasn't in trouble. But I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this is going to be another Enron. And I'm going to be involved in it for the next 5 years of my career. And, it's in Jackson, so I'm not going to be commuting and everything. I was just thinking, oh, well, so I thought, it'd be a challenge, though. So I walk into the SAC's office with Perry, and there's a really excellent agent named Jenny Williams from Jackson is sitting there. And the SAC and Perry and I sit down. And the SAC, who was a guy named Ed Worthington, also a great guy. It sounds like everyone's great guys, but most of them are in the FBI. So Ed started telling me a little bit about what had happened. And this is, first I'll talk about the early stages of the investigation, then I'll talk about kind of internal things at WorldCom that led to that point. But what Ed told me is that three kind of low-level accountants at WorldCom had come in Wednesday of that week and had met with Jenny and another agent. And they were represented by a local lawyer in Jackson who brought them in to talk to Jenny and the other agent. And that they had basically laid out this just unbelievable to me facts about what had been going on at WorldCom. I was told at that time that these accountants said that every quarter, for 5 quarters, that they had been instructed to take money that was expenses, like I'll give you an example of that in a minute, but to take money that was expenses and reclassify it so that it did not show up as a current expense on the WorldCom books. And they said it started out fairly small, which fairly small was $544 million. And over the next 5 quarters, it grew to almost $1 billion a quarter.
Wow.
Where they were taking money that should have been, that should have been shown up with WorldCom having $1 billion in expense, or $941 million was the biggest in the fourth quarter of 2001. So that was just a couple months earlier. And they said $941 million that should have been classified as an expense was being delayed. I'll explain the mechanism later in a little bit, but it was being delayed. So what it did is it took WorldCom from a $700 million loss for that quarter to about a $200 million profit that they were showing. I said, what? I mean, that's all there is to it? Because, as you know from the Enron presentation, Enron was very complicated, a lot of partnerships, a lot of accounting, you really had to dig into the numbers. But this was like, I was just shocked because I said, that's it? I mean, that's really what happened? And we've already got 3 people telling us that they did it. And they said, yes. And I'm like, wow.
I'm sure you're thinking, yeah, I'll take that case. It looks like, easy peasy.
Exactly. That's what immediately I thought, we can wrap this case up in a couple of weeks, a few weeks. And I was just kind of flabbergasted. And they said, so what Ed had told, I'll call him Ed, just for what the SAC Worthington said, because you've got Jenny also had 15 years in, but she was actually went in a year before me, but she didn't have the magic SAA behind her name. So they thought that we wanted an accountant to be the case agent. Because I'll tell you why, because this became a big battle with the Southern District of New York for prosecuting this case. But I think what Ed's thinking was that having a CPA with 15 years in the Bureau, with Jenny as my co-case agent, basically, this would sell better in Washington. And I think it was good thinking I guess it's good thinking by Ed. Didn't work out that way. We'll get into that. And what they then told me was that the 3 accountants were coming back for a further debriefing, and they were going to bring documents. and stuff, and they were coming in an hour. And so I said, okay, great. And they wanted me and Jenny to do the interview. And I said, oh, I'm dressed in jeans and a polo shirt. And they said, that's fine. I said, great. So we sat down and we interviewed the three accountants again. It was these three people came in, and it was really interesting, their interview.
Well, let me ask you this before you talk about their interview. Did they come in as an attempt to save their own skin, or were they truly upset that this company was committing fraud?
Okay, good. I'll get into that first then. So the reason they were there is a woman named Cynthia Cooper and her team at WorldCom. Okay, Cynthia Cooper was in internal audit at WorldCom. She actually became a little famous out of this. She made the cover of Time magazine as a whistleblower. It was a year, the whistleblower, person of the year was whistleblower. And they had actually an FBI agent, Colleen Rowley, that had blown the whistle on some 9/11 stuff. And then Cynthia Cooper. And the third one was a woman at Enron, and they were the women of the year.
Yeah, yep. I remember that. Yep. I actually may have a copy of that cover someplace. I'll have to look.
So Cynthia, she wrote a book about this, and I read it a few years ago, and I glanced through it getting ready for this for this interview with you. Cynthia was just a small town Mississippi girl that got an accounting degree and went to work in Atlanta for a while, came back and got a job with WorldCom, another company than with WorldCom. She became the vice president of internal audit. And at that time, WorldCom was obviously growth business. They were grow, and they didn't really care much about internal audit. She fought some battles getting taken seriously. But eventually she got a little more staff. And they had read an article from an old WorldCom employee that had kind of hinted at some of this stuff. And so she and her team had started digging into it. And they really did a great job. They dug the entries out. They ended up totaling like 900 million, but there were a lot of entries that composed that 900 million. But they put it all together, and they realized that they had a major problem. First, they went to the three employees and asked them because these are the three employees. They were Troy Norman, Betty Vinson, and Buddy Yates had made the entries, and they asked them about it. And they gave the internal audit, Cynthia Cooper and her team, very poor answers, and pretty much deflected up to the controller, a guy named David Myers. So they went and talked to David Myers about it. And Myers also didn't have good answers. He deflected them up to the CEO, Scott Sullivan. Scott Sullivan told them, look, this isn't important. You guys should focus on something else and, come back to this later. And he really tried to stop the investigation. But by now, Cynthia Cooper thought this is a really major problem. She ended up going to the board of WorldCom and to the external auditors, which at that time was, I think it was Deloitte, and we'll get into that. But she went to them and pressed this to where Troy Norman, Betty Vinson, and Buddy Yates realized this was not going away and that they were going to be the people. Yeah, like you said, they were looking to cover themselves as best they could. So they went and contacted a guy named John Holloman, who was an experienced lawyer and experienced federal lawyer in Jackson, and said, we need to talk to the FBI. So that's how it happened. So it was really the internal pressure. But I will tell you that I did feel, and that's what I was going to talk about. So what had happened is Myers had come to them the first time. This is back in the first quarter of 2000. Myers had come to them and said, you need to do this, that the first number was $544 million. You guys need to make entries that can take $544 million of expenses and spread it out over 10 years. And let me tell you, this gets into a little bit of accounting, and the people that are bored by accounting can tune out now. But the way they did this was WorldCom was leasing phone lines from other telecom companies. And, a lease is just a 1-year deal where they would lease this space on these lines for a year and pay the company millions of dollars because they were, collecting millions allegedly from their customers. Now, WorldCom also built a good amount of fiber optic lines and stuff. So when you build it, so let's say WorldCom builds $10 million worth of fiber optic lines. Well, WorldCom is allowed to, by accounting rules, spread that. They spend $10 million to do it, but they're allowed for their profit and loss statement to say that this is going to last 10 years. So we only have to recognize $10 million a year as
Isn't that
expenses.
called like amortize? What's the word?
Yep, amortization or depreciation. Yep,
Okay.
yep, you got it. So they're allowed to, match it to when the expense, like it's going to last you 10 years. They try and estimate how long it's going to last. And you get to say, okay, we're going to take 10, instead of taking 10 million the first year, we're going to take $1 million each year and put it as expenses. And that helps your profits, obviously, because you're not having to claim 10 million as expenses in the first year. And WorldCom did a lot of that. But they also leased these things to which they had no right whatsoever after the lease was done. They were not going to get any benefit from that lease in future years. So under accounting rules, like say they went to another Sprint and said, okay, or a Baby Bell and said, we're going to lease this line from you. We're going to pay you $10 million for a year. Well, that's a current expense that year. That's $10 million that's going to go against your bottom line because it doesn't give you any future benefit. But what Myers told we ended up calling them the three amigos. No, it's because when we talk about them, we just called them the three amigos because they were good friends. So what he had told them to do was they needed $544 million. They said, take current expenses, put them into capital expenses, and amortize or depreciate them. So instead of recognizing, they recognize, so that's $544 million that they took out of current expenses and kicked it down kick the can down the road. They only took $54 million this year and put the rest of it down the future years.
Now, is there any way to justify that, to rationalize that was anything but fraud or illegal?
Well, so the three amigos asked Myers, well, where's the support for this, right? The accounting support. And Myers told them, there is none. Scott said to do it, who's the CEO, just do it. CFO, Chief Financial Officer, said, just do it. And so this really concerned them because they knew that, they were accountants. They had gotten accounting degrees. They knew this was totally wrong. Troy Norman wrote a resignation letter that he later showed us and we verified was written right there and then when he was initially told. Betty Benson said she had talked to her husband about it and they all were extremely concerned. They asked to speak to Scott Sullivan. Eventually Sullivan talked to him and here's the rationale Sullivan said, we're having a tough year. We're having a tough quarter. And really we want to match our revenues against the expenses. And this is just to do that this is just a sophisticated way to match our future revenues against our future expenses, which no one believed it when Scott Sullivan started bringing it up to the board and the outside auditors. But I think the three accountants, that they kind of rationalized a little bit and said, well, Scott's smarter than we are. Maybe he knows something we don't. Plus, they had pretty good jobs in Mississippi. There weren't a ton of accounting jobs. So I think that I feel for these people somewhat. They were in a bad place, right? Because your option then is resign or do it, right? I don't see a real good option. And they went as high as they could. They went to the second in command. They didn't go to Bernie Ebbers, but they went to Scott Sullivan.
And did they discuss it among themselves also?
Oh, yes. Yes, okay. Extensively. Yeah, they all sat in the same office. They discussed it extensively, how much it bothered them. But Sullivan also assured them that this was just going to be a one-time deal, that they would get it straightened out when their revenues picked up. And so they kind of that was another thing that they could kind of rationalize. Then it happened the next quarter and it went up to $560 million. So they kind of had the same, trepidation. But Scott, Myers again tells them, this is the number I got from Scott. And don't worry, we're not going to have to do this anymore. We don't think everything's going to get turned around. So now they're in for a dime and for a dollar. And it kept rocking along. It went to $743 million the next quarter, $941 million the next quarter. And then the most recently completed quarter was $818 million. So it actually did get a little bit better, but not much. So $3.6 billion over 5 quarters. And if if WorldCom had not done that, they would have shown significant losses they would have, their stock would have cratered even more, and there would be serious concern about whether they could keep going as a business. So the three accountants, they told us about this. They told us about their what their problems were, and their story never changed one bit. And they just said, "This is what happened to us. We want to try and, I don't know about make it right." But like you said, the motivation was mainly because they got caught by Cynthia Cooper and her team. But then it was also, I think in some ways, you've seen this, Jerry, where sometimes the white collar criminals are almost relieved when they get caught because it's eating at them so bad. And they were almost relieved. You could tell it was just kind of nice to get it off their chest.
Did they ask for immunity? Did they sign a proffer letter? What kind of assurances did they have that they were not going to be charged criminally for this matter? Or did they come in not knowing how it was going to work out?
They got a proffer, but they got no promises because we didn't at that point know really how it was going to work out. So they got no promises on, it was a typical, your cooperation will be taken into consideration by the United States Attorney's Office and the sentencing judge. And so it's just strictly a proffer where we couldn't use what they said against them personally. So that was it. So after we completed that interview, we went out, Jenny and I went out to David Meyer's house because now it was Friday evening, about 6 or 7 in the evening. We went out to David Meyer's house. And David Myers had a nice house in Jackson, and he greeted us at the door. He talked to us for a little while, but then he decided that he needed a lawyer and that, he didn't give us anything very useful, but then we talked to him for probably 10 minutes and then he thought that he should get a lawyer. And when he did that, the interview ended. So Jenny and I go back and we talk with the SAC again, and we're like, okay, well, this looks like you said, this looks like a slam dunk. We have got this case. They brought in lots of paperwork, that they had done to support it. And we're like, wow, this is basically a made case. Now we felt pretty confident that Scott Sullivan and David Myers, we would be able to, with the testimony of the three accountants, that we would be able to indict and perhaps hopefully convict them. But the one thing we didn't have, and we asked the three accountants and said, do you have any indication that Bernie Ebbers was aware of this? And they said, no, we don't. We just talked to Scott. Scott said, something along the lines of Bernie was okay with it or something like that, but they had no direct evidence. We immediately contacted Cynthia Cooper. Unbeknownst to us, and Joe actually told us this, Joe Holloman, she had also become concerned, and I'll tell you why in a minute, about where she stood in this investigation. And she had contacted Joe Holloman on Friday evening after we had talked to them about representing her personally. And here's why that happened. Because WorldCom's corporate attorneys had contacted the Southern District of New York once the board was made aware of this by Cynthia Cooper, which was generally on that Thursday, Friday timeline. We were talking to the accountants. And the corporate attorneys in New York had told the Southern District of New York. The Southern District of New York generated a subpoena for Cynthia Cooper that they sent to her on Friday evening and told her that she had to be in New York on Sunday morning to be interviewed. I didn't know this until I read Cynthia Cooper's book, because I was wondering how the Southern District of New York got involved in it so fast, but but they sent her and they called her and said that if she did not appear on Sunday morning in New York, that she would be in contempt of court and be arrested. This was the hero.
Yeah, this is the person who's brought all this matter to the attention of the board. And how is it that she's being treated like she is solely responsible for what happened?
I think, and we'll get into this, it's because the Southern District of New York really wanted this case. And they thought that if they got Cynthia Cooper up there, that would help. They didn't know at this point about the three accountants, but they really wanted this case. And so,
well, did they contact your district in Mississippi to see if any activity was going on down there?
We'll get to that.
Okay. Sounds like a power grab, but I can't wait to hear more.
But so Cynthia Cooper was saying, wait a minute, I can't come up there on Sunday morning. That's the day after, I got tomorrow and I got to fly up there tomorrow. And she was worried that maybe somehow WorldCom was trying to turn this on her and somehow trying to say that she had, and they were not, she said, can you send me then she went to Joe Holloman. And on Saturday, Joe Holloman calls and says, send me the subpoena. And suddenly the subpoena can't be located because there's no, as you and I know, grand juries don't meet on Sunday. Right, Jerry? So there's no possible way that the grand jury subpoena could call for her to be there on Sunday.
Yeah, that's true.
So Joe never got a subpoena, and he told them, no, my client is not coming to New York. And Joe then Joe was a former AUSA in the Southern District of Mississippi. He knew that he had already brought in the three amigos, so he contacted the Southern District of Mississippi and told them all about what New York had done with Cynthia Cooper on Friday evening. And I heard about this, later Friday evening. So what was worked out was that Cynthia Cooper would come into the Southern District of Mississippi on Sunday morning and be interviewed because she wanted to be interviewed. And Joe had assured her that, she would get a good hearing in the Southern District of Mississippi, and that New York would send an attorney down to participate in that interview, and that we would do it on a video conference with additional attorneys in New York. The interesting thing is the FBI in New York never tried to make a grab on this case. I talked to some FBI agents and the FBI supervisor in New York early on, and they said, no, you guys, everything's there. You guys might as well work it. It sounds like the case is basically made. And we were like, okay, great. So this is strictly a Southern District of New York, the Sovereign District of New York, as you may have heard it called.
And what was their rationale as far as jurisdiction?
Well, because WorldCom was traded on the stock markets, and
right. Even though their corporate office was in Mississippi, it was a power grab.
Yeah, it was a power grab. And so what happens is, Cynthia Cooper tells us all about her thing. She had another guy that in her office came in that morning too, and also told he was the guy that kind of did the computer digging, and they laid it all out. It was the exact same story that, they didn't know, that we didn't tell them at that time that the three amigos had already come in, and Joe did not either. But I think he did because he was concerned about a conflict. So she probably did know, she said, no, that's fine, that she was content being represented by Joe also. Yeah, she comes in and tells us basically the same story. So we're pretty content with the investigation right now. We've got the three accountants. But what we don't have is any evidence of Bernie Ebbers. And we don't have any emails or things like that to support what the accountants are telling us. We have their entries. We have what all three of them will say David Myers and Scott Sullivan told them. But we're hoping to get emails. As you know, emails are sometimes the best evidence. We're hoping to get internally WorldCom emails where this was discussed. On Monday, this was our first big conflict with New York. So what DOJ originally decided is that it's going to be worked jointly by Southern District of New York and Southern District of Mississippi, but that the Jackson FBI would be the investigating agency. And we're like, great. Hopefully we can live with that. The New York people were very interesting. The prosecutor came out Sunday morning. He was talking about all these interviews that he was going to do. And I talked to him and said, I said, are you an investigator or a prosecutor? His answer was, with a totally straight face, both. And I said, oh, okay, well.
And then what do they need you for? Yeah.
Yeah, what do they need me for? To take notes is what basically it became in a lot of ways when we did general interviews. That's what it became, is where I took notes because they couldn't testify in court. So we assembled a team. We assembled a team in Jackson of about 8 agents. Jenny and I were the co-case agents, basically, and then about 6 other agents. And we brought in an ASAC, John Kingston, an ASAC from San Diego who had extensive white-collar background. He was going to run the investigation. And he was a great guy. We had morning meeting every morning at 8 o'clock, a night meeting at 6 o'clock. We had a conference call with New York every night at 6 o'clock. And we did a lot of interviews. Who we were talking to was the accountants under the three amigos that were kind of told by them, just make these entries, or how can we make these entries? And there were a number of accountants in Jackson, and there were a number scattered around the country. So we had agents flying out to talk to these accountants and people in WorldCom people. But the big conflict was we wanted to do a search warrant at WorldCom for the computers of all of the major players. Ebbers, Sullivan, Myers, the three amigos, everyone. We wanted to get their computers and also execute a search warrant on the servers to get all the emails involving those people. New York told us that they would prefer to just ask the corporate attorney who are based in New York, the corporate attorneys for WorldCom for that information. And we were kind of skeptical that, maybe we wouldn't get every single email if we did that. And we had a major conflict over that. And finally, we won, basically. We just said, we're going to do this search warrant. We have probable cause to do it. We're going to do it. Why are we going to wait around for lawyers to produce this stuff 6 months from now?
And why did they want to do that? Was it a matter of keeping goodwill between these high-powered attorneys in New York? Maybe future bosses?
I really think, I think that's plus that was a way for them to control it, right? If we did a search warrant in the Southern District of Mississippi, the Southern District of Mississippi would control the evidence, whereas it was turned over by the corporate lawyers to New York, they would control it. And so we won that battle. So we ended up doing a search warrant like Monday or Tuesday. We went in after WorldCom basically closed down for the day. And this was a massive undertaking. We probably had 20 agents out there with our whole CART team. I think we brought in some CART people from around the region to take copies of the hard drives of the various people and stuff. So I didn't know this until I read Cynthia Cooper's book. Cynthia Cooper was there at the time. And it was Jenny or a woman named another female agent named Teresa Hathcock. I don't know which one it was, but they had responsibility for Cynthia Cooper's office. And Cynthia said that she was really nervous about all this, but that the agent had winked at her and told her, this is a really great thing that you did. And she said that made her feel so good. And so we did the search warrants. We collected all this evidence. So we're rocking along. We think, this is going well. New York keeps pushing DOJ to make this a New York case and to get the Southern District of Mississippi, because we were butting heads. We butted heads on that. We give you another issue. We butted heads on. New York also told us that we could not interview any more WorldCom employees because they were all represented by the law firm in New York, and that we would have to go through the law firm in New York to interview any more WorldCom employees. This was after we'd probably done about 10 or 15 interviews besides the 3 accountants. The way the Southern District of Mississippi and the FBI understood it was that was fine for corporate officers, but that line employees, and that's kind of a general interpretation, if you represent a corporation, you can represent the officers and directors, but line employees are not represented by that law firm automatically. If we went and talked to them and they told us, no, I'm represented by so-and-so out of New York, then we would not conduct an interview. But there's nothing stopping us from trying to interview them. But New York said they didn't even want us to try. They wanted us to just put in a request, and they would request the law firm to make the employee available to us. We told them, no, we're not going to do it that way. They said, you have to. That's what we're doing. No agreement. But Ed Worthington and the chief criminal prosecutor in the Southern District of Mississippi said, forget them. We're under no obligation to not interview these people. We're going to keep interviewing. And so we kept interviewing. And no, they didn't know about it. I'll tell you why in a little bit, but they didn't know about it. So we've done a search warrant. We've done a lot. We've done probably now 25, 30 interviews of employees. This case is made. It was made from the first minute that the 3 amigos walked in. But now we're just tightening it up. And this was probably about July 10th now. And I've been working every hour, working many hours and every day since that first Friday. But then it came down that DOJ had decided that the Southern District of New York would prosecute the case, but that the Jackson FBI would be the investigative agency. And I thought, that stinks, because now I'm going to be traveling in New York all the time. I'm going to have to deal with these people that we really don't have a great relationship with. And, this is just going to make my life more complicated because, and everyone on the team's life more complicated because we're going to be traveling to New York for interviews because we're not going to do any more interviews on our own. They're all going to be with prosecutors from New York. And I just think, oh my gosh. But, it wasn't a big surprise. Because Southern District of New York held a lot of sway in DOJ. Southern District of Mississippi didn't have much. But I was kind of honored that we were at first, thinking, but it's kind of nice that we're left in charge. They didn't say that the New York FBI is going to work it. But immediately then the question became, okay, we've got to now tell the Southern District of New York that we've been interviewing people. So we had an
Oops.
extremely interesting conference call that evening. It was the SAC, myself, the ASAC, Jenny, and the lead criminal prosecutor guy from the Southern District of Mississippi was just there more for moral support since they had been told they were out. But we sat there and told them, and they actually had the chief assistant and a bunch of prosecutors online, and we told them that we had interviewed these additional 12 people. And they said, what? We said, yeah, we interviewed them. And here's what we got. Well, they started, it was one of the most interesting conference calls I've ever had. They screamed and yelled and told us that we were jeopardizing the case and that it was all going to go to pieces because of us and whatever. So we said, okay, well, we kind of left it at that. And the next day, the word comes down from Bureau headquarters that the New York FBI would be investigating the case going forward, and that Jackson would not be the lead investigative office.
Wow. And that decision was made by, I guess, the assistant director in New York or somebody in headquarters.
Headquarters, because I think it was pushed by New York and DOJ that we had, violated our agreement. We had done this behind their backs or whatever. I don't know, I don't know the whole machinations. All I know is that, the SAC got a call saying, this case will be New York or their office of origin. And we're like, and I'm still thinking, oh, shoot, that's not really going to help me a lot because I know a lot about this case. I'm probably still going to be making lots of trips to New York and helping out. Like the next day, I was going to go to New York and brief the agents on the case and what we had done. And, Jackson's packing up all the evidence we seized in the search warrant, everything, and send it to New York. So I went up and I met with the ADIC and the assistant director in charge in New York and the white collar SAC. And they were very nice. And I have nothing but praise for the New York FBI and how they did the whole thing. Southern District of New York, not so much. So, I met with them and I met with the two guys that were going to be the case agents. I just had a really good discussion and, briefed them up on the whole thing and spent, hours talking to the case agents. And I thought, they were of the opinion, that I would be coming up there and participating in interviews and stuff. And I was, telling my wife, this is not going to be fun for a few months, but we'll get through it. She had 3 young kids at home, so she wasn't really super enthusiastic about that. So I got back to Mississippi and got a couple calls from New York, but never went back. A couple times they would call me and ask me a couple specifics. The case was so simple, too. That was what the beauty of it. It was just they could, from what we had done, from reading the 302s and stuff, they could say, okay, this is it.
So what was left for them to do as far as investigation?
Try to get Bernie Evers, mainly, right? Go through all the stuff we had seized in the search warrant, see if they could get evidence on Bernie. Because, we felt like Myers was gone and Scott Sullivan was gone. They'd both gotten lawyers and we had the Southern District of Mississippi and New York and started talking to their lawyers. But it was really get Myers and Sullivan and the 3 accountants who end up getting indicted, and then see if they could get Evers, roll it into Evers. That's what was left. And I followed the case, like in our primitive computer system at the time. I would see what look in every couple of weeks and see what was going on. And the agents, they did several more interviews, but every interview they did was at the Southern District of New York with the prosecutors. And, basically they were there to take, no offense against New York, but they were there to take notes and put stuff into 302s. So I now, go and jump ahead. That's pretty much my involvement. And New York's involvement was a few interviews and then participating in negotiations with Myers and Sullivan's lawyers.
And so how did this all end for WorldCom? Could you kind of sum up who was charged and, what type of sentencings occurred?
Right. So WorldCom ended up declaring the biggest bankruptcy at that time in the history of the United States because of this. And their stock went down to basically worthless. They came out of bankruptcy as MCI because they didn't want the WorldCom name, but they never were a player and they hung around for a few years, but basically you've never, MCI is, I think, still in existence, but not a major player. So that was what happened to WorldCom itself. People lost billions. Investors lost billions because the stock went from a very high price down to nothing. As a matter of fact, I learned later that I lost some money because my father-in-law, who had died in 1999, had some WorldCom stock. And they hadn't settled the estate yet, but it basically went down to zero. Well, it did a lot of money, but it was, it was like, I didn't know that until later on. When I was talking to my sister-in-law, she said, yeah, we had, he had about 50,000 WorldCom stock that went down to zero. I'm like, oh, wow, great. But so what happened to the players? There are basically 6 players, right? So the sentence is, what happened is Myers pled guilty pretty early on, and he agreed to testify against Sullivan. He did not know him much of it. He did not have direct dealings with Bernie Ebbers. So now Sullivan has been indicted. They're negotiating with Sullivan's lawyer. Sullivan says that he told Bernie Ebbers on several occasions what he was doing, and Bernie authorized him to do it. But Bernie Ebbers, despite being a tech company CEO, did not use email at all. So there is no record of Ebbers ever knowing about this scheme, direct evidence like an email where Scott Sullivan says, hey, this month we're going to do, this quarter we're going to do 743 million. It's basically Ebbers' word plus the fact that the CEO must have known it. And a lot of others, kind of weird. Ebbers had been in a little financial trouble himself, and he had sold a lot of WorldCom stock and stuff like that. So the sentence is, Troy Norman, the junior accountant, got probation. Betty Venson, the next most in the chain of command, got 5 months. Buddy Yates, he was the supervisor of Venson, he got a year. Myers also got a year. Sullivan got 5 years. Bernie Ebbers went to trial. Scott Sullivan was the star witness against him. Bernie Ebbers was convicted, and Bernie Ebbers got 25 years. So, and he, as I told you, he was released from prison in December of last year and died in February of 2020. One other quick thing I wanted to bring up was Arthur Anderson. Arthur Anderson was the accountants, and this just because I'm an accounting nerd. Arthur Anderson was the accountants on Enron. Because of Enron, they had basically gone under shortly before the WorldCom scandal broke, and they were also WorldCom's auditors. But they had been because they had gone under because of the Enron, that they were replaced by Deloitte, who did the right thing, and they helped to bring this. Once Cynthia Cooper came to them, they helped to force this out into the open. But these were such basic entries, these entries, and one of the first things you learn as an accountant, as an auditor, is always look at the adjusting entries at the end of the quarter, because those are usually unusual. Like it's not the run-of-the-mill business things. These are unusual entries, and those get extra scrutiny as an accountant. And that's why I was just mystified from the beginning. As a matter of fact, I told you we talked to Myers on that Friday night. I think Monday night, we went to the home of the Arthur Anderson partner in charge of the WorldCom audit. And I knocked on his door. He came to the door. We told him who we were. He told us that he would have to talk to his attorney. And we said that was fine. But it being an accountant and a little bit of a smart aleck, I said, listen, I was an accountant. And I said, how did you guys, I said, this isn't for the record, but I said, how did you guys not catch this? And he hung his head and he said, you're going to have to talk to my lawyer. Couldn't believe that if they were doing their jobs, they wouldn't have seen this in the first couple of quarters and kept it from going on. But I never did get an explanation. Arthur Anderson was already out of business, so they were never charged. They were charged in the Enron investigation. They were never charged. We never did much, at least at the time I was with it. We didn't do much of an investigation.
So the outside accounting firm, had a responsibility, but the inside accountants had more than that. The fact that they looked the other way, was criminal. So I guess the moral of the story is that just because your boss tells you to do something, that is not enough to get you out of being charged criminally for something that you violate, at work.
Especially when it's billions of dollars. If this had been $100,000, $200,000 fraud, $1 million fraud, and they had come forward, maybe they would have ended up all with probation or not even with felony convictions. But New York eventually made that decision to charge the 3 accountants, and I agree with that, because I think even though they had been in a bad situation, they still, they should have refused to do it, or once they'd done it, maybe gone to somebody and said, "Look, we got a problem," but they didn't.
All right.
until Cynthia Cooper came along and asked them, and then they did tell her they didn't tell her the whole truth, but they told her, that Myers had told them to do it, and they didn't have any support.
So anyone who is, interested in learning more, I actually have two episodes. Of course, the one that you mentioned, I spoke with Michael Anderson about Enron, and that was episode 129. But I also spoke with retired agent Vic Hartman in episode 210, and he did kind of an overview of corporate fraud investigations, and he mentioned both Enron and WorldCom in his episode. So those are two episodes that if you want to learn more about corporate fraud, you should definitely check out. But now I would love to talk about this whole tension and conflict with the U.S. Attorney's Office because, in my time as an agent, I work economic fraud. That does come up occasionally. I mean, most of the time I've had wonderful relationships with the assistant United States attorneys that I worked with, great relationships. Whenever I started a new case, I knew exactly who I wanted to reach out to and hoped that they were going to be free to be the prosecutor on those cases. Was this the first time that you had any type of conflict with the United States Attorney's Office?
Major conflict, yes. I mean, as you know, in every case, there's minor conflicts. There's, discussions, maybe even disagreements about the way to go on the case. And a lot of times, in many cases, we really don't get the U.S. Attorney's Office involved until, latter stages of it. But
that's how I prefer it. That's how.
Yes. The normal give and take. But this is the first time that I saw this. I mean, I told you that some of the civil rights cases that you would also have the Department of Justice involved, those attorneys, and that's different because the level of oversight and their level of involvement in the case is just night and day to a local U.S. Attorney's Office. So there were kind of more conflicts there, but nothing to where it just got to where we could not come to an agreement. I mean, this was just a first for me, and I was just like kind of amazed. And I was, like I said, when they didn't call me, my heart was not broken because I didn't have to deal with the prosecutors in New York anymore, and I could just kind of sit back and go on about my small cases in Mississippi.
Yeah, and I agree. The relationship is usually, pretty good. I like to stress to people when, I'm talking to the public about the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office that the FBI investigates and the U.S. Attorney's Office prosecutes. Of course, the U.S. Attorney's Office needs to weigh in on the investigation, almost consult, because we got to make sure that we are bringing them the evidence that they believe that they'll need to prosecute the case. So you do have to cooperate on that. It hopefully is a good relationship because you're sitting right there at the prosecution table with them, as a member of the team, when somebody does go to trial.
Some of the best people I've worked with are AUSAs. I mean, some of the good friends to this day are AUSAs that I've worked with on cases, and we just have a great relationship. Not always, but the vast majority of the time, there any disagreements or minor disagreements because we all have the same goal.
Well, thank you very much for coming on to talk about WorldCom. I'm at the point of the interview where I usually ask you when you joined the FBI and why you joined the FBI, but you've already told that story the first time I interviewed you in episode 91. But I do want to give you the last word. So what would you like to say?
So what I would like to do is kind of recognize a good friend of mine, an FBI agent who died, a former FBI agent who died on Friday. His name was Jim Davis. He was an accountant like me that came into the FBI in 1985 like me. We met up in Chicago where we were transferred to work on a big undercover case in the commodities exchanges. Jim was just a great guy. Jim rose much higher in the FBI than me. He became the SAC of Denver, and he was the lead guy in Iraq at the time that Saddam Hussein was captured. And there's a picture of Jim with his hand on Saddam. Jim was 6'8", very large guy, and he had his hand on Saddam Hussein's shoulder. And Jim was out walking his dog Friday morning and died of a heart attack. And there's been some articles in the Denver press that everyone just loved Jim because he was a great guy. And I stayed in touch with him a little bit over the years. I saw him about 5 years ago when I was in Denver, but I hadn't talked to him in probably 2, maybe even 3 years. And it just hit me hard that here's a guy the same age as me, exact same age, basically the same background. And so my little thing to your listeners would be, if there's somebody you haven't talked to in a while, reach out to them. We're not guaranteed anything in this life. And, reach out. If you got somebody you need to patch things up with, reach out. Not to Jim and I, but I just really wish I had talked to him in the last year just to check in. Great guy, and he's going to be missed. Great agent also.
And that's the end of the interview. At jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a photo of Kevin Rust and newspaper articles about the WorldCom investigation. Kevin asked that I dedicate this episode to the memory of his friend and colleague, retired FBI agent Jim Davis. So also in the show notes, you will find a link to Jim Davis's obituary and an article about Jim Davis's remarkable FBI and post-FBI careers. And of course, the photo of Jim Davis during the capture of Saddam Hussein. I hope you enjoyed the episode and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. If they're not sure how to listen to a podcast, have them read the post on my website, How to Listen to a Podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to FBI Retired Case File Review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. I would also love it if you checked out the link for my books in your podcast app's description of this episode. My nonfiction books, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, a manual for armchair detectives, which goes through 20 cliches and misconceptions about the FBI in books, TV, and movies. And then there's the companion book, FBI Word Search Puzzles, Fun for Armchair Detectives. My FBI Philadelphia Corruption Squad crime series features flawed female FBI agent Carrie Wheeler in Pay to Play and Greedy Givers. All of my books are available wherever books are sold as ebooks, print books, and audiobooks. If you've already picked up copies of my books, please consider leaving a review. Reviews help readers find good books. Thank you for listening to the very end, and I hope you come back again for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.